Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Today is January 1st, 2021. We have gotten past 2020. And when I asked myself, who would I want to start a wonderful new year with, only one name came to mind, and that is Frederica, who joins me today from California. I'm in New York. Flicka, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. It's a Christmas present, a late Christmas present to see you.
So good to see you. I'm thrilled. Um, I'm never at a loss for words, but where do I begin with Frederica von Stade? I think I know. I remember the first time I saw you perform. I was 14 and you were not much more than that. And it was at the Metropolitan Opera, and I went to see Mozart's Magic Flute. My father took me, and I didn't know that I was seeing Frederica von Stade because you, and not for the first time or the last, were playing a little boy. This was really a little boy. This was one of the three genies in the Magic Flute who float above and they sing and they guide Papageno on his way. And these were incredibly formidable genies. It was Gail Robinson, Judith Forst, and you. Uh, since then, the Met has used really little boys. But at that time, there you were. Nikolai Gedda was Papageno, and Lucia Pop was in it, and Herman Pry. And the reason that I attended this performance was I was studying with Herman Pry. And he wanted me to come because I was studying actually the Papageno arias. And he wanted me to come. So that's how I didn't know I was going to see you, but I did. That
Now,
was your Met debut in 1970.
now, do you know? Can I tell you why they used girls instead of boys for those years? Because it was the Marc Chagall uh, decor, and we did come down on a bench from way above the proscenium and had to wait up there for quite a long time. And apparently, when they used kids, the boys would throw things down on the stage or spitballs and things like that. So they thought, we can't deal with this. So that's how I got the job. A spitball.
You had been in the National Council competition, and Rudolph Bing heard you and offered you an audition, and you were engaged. And I went to look back at the year 1970, just the year 1970, and what you sang there. It was January 10th of 1970 was your debut, so we're talking 51 years ago.
Yeah.
And a few days later, a month later, you were in La Fanciulla del West with Renata Tebaldi as Wauclay, who is the Indian woman, the squaw, who speaks only in infinitive verbs. She doesn't conjugate her verbs to make her sound ignorant. And nowadays this would not be acceptable.
Right.
But you singing with Renata Tebaldi and basically being her housemaid
Uh-huh.
and keeper. What did you get from Tebaldi as a professional?
Well, when she would come into the opera house, and in those days, Fred, as you know, there wasn't all this glass and protection, and it was very homey. It was wonderful. And so she would come in with her lovely gal that helped her and her dog, her poodle, and this beautiful, beautiful gold jewelry and her marvelous face and a fur coat and hat. She was the true diva. The whole house was talking about it. Everyone, stagehands, anybody. The stagehands, the most important people in the house.
Oh, yes.
So it was very, very exciting. But I remember very specifically, I had to zip her dress before a part in the opera where she had a really beautiful high note to sing, and she was a wreck. And I can remember it's near a line where she says, "Hey, miei scarpetti," and she would reach into this drawer in the Wild West and pull out the most perfect pair of Italian shoes, perfectly dyed to match her costume. I mean, who couldn't worship her, frankly? Who couldn't, you know? It was so exciting, and it was Fausto Cleva, I think, who
Yes,
conducted. Yeah,
and Sandor Konya.
that's
So
right. That's
this
right.
this was like Met School because then you were Flora, which is a step up in La Traviata with Marilyn Niska and George Shirley.
Uh-huh.
And then you were in Romeo and Juliet, the French version, as Stefano, one performance only, with Franco Corelli and Jeanette Pilou.
That's right. That's right.
And so here you, Nicolai Getta, Herman Pry, Lucia Pop, Renata Tibaldi, Sandra Konya, George Shirley, Marilyn Niska, Franco Corelli in 2 months. And then you were the shepherd in Tosca
Tosca, that's right.
with
Oh,
Gabriele
God.
Tucci, Richard Tucker, Gabrielle Bacquier, and then big step up, Niklaus in Les Contes d'Hoffmann with Nicolai Getta again, Rary Grist, Rosalind Elias, Pilar Lorengar. These are not only legendary names, but these are all role models, I think.
Oh, I'll tell you, it was heaven, just heaven. I had funny stories on almost all of them. I got a little too aggressive doing the sword fight as, not Tebaldo, as Stefano.
Stefano.
And I think I nearly removed Corelli's finger in my fight. And remember, there was a wonderful instructor at the Met then who said, Flick, I think you need to just don't take it quite like you have to give every inch of your power to this sword fight. Oh my, and when we were cover artists, compromario artists then, we spent most of our days that we weren't rehearsing in the hall, in the opera house, listening to everything. And I went to everything. I went to every rehearsal I was free for. So talk about a great education. And I had no opera in my background. So it was,
Right.
when I went to school, I didn't know who Mozart was. How's that?
Well, then you were in one of my very favorite operas, the role of Bercy in Andrea Chenier, with, again, Carla Bergonzi,
Yeah.
exemplar of Italian style, Renata Tibaldi, Anselmo Colzani. And then you were knocked down a few pegs in terms of the size of the role. You were a flower maiden in Parsifal with Helga Brilliot, Christa Ludwig, Thomas Stewart,
Yes.
and Cesare Siepi, and we're still in 1970. And you conclude the year in La Petite Cole, not as La Petite Cole, which you would later do, but as Virginella, and Teresa Stratas was La Petite Cole.
With Terry, our beloved Terry, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm just turning off.
that's okay.
Sorry, I just have to turn off my iPad. It's dinging.
That's
Oh,
okay.
it's
So
only a
I'm
gentle
going to
ding.
mention then that after that, you were one of the unborn in Die Frauen Schatten, Leonie
Yeah.
Rieseneck, Carl Böhm, Christa Ludwig, Lola in Cavalleria Rusticana, Fiorenza Cosotto, Mercedes in Carmen with an all-star cast, Sibel in Faust, Raina Kabiavanska, Giorgio Tozzi, Franco Bonisoli. And I mention these because this was kind of like your training ground.
Yes, it was.
And as you
So
mentioned, you got
lucky.
to hear and see. Was there any artist who really affected you and struck you among those from that first year?
Oh my gosh, I can't. I'll tell you who really struck me, and it was because of a funny incident. It was in Flora, and I did it with one cast that it was Sutherland. It was Joan who was doing the lead, and in one of the scenes, the third act, I think, or whatever the big scene is with the whole company on stage, I was standing behind her. And you remember, I don't know if you remember, the costumes at that time were magnificent. I mean, I had a Boucher painting almost embroidered on the front of my costume. But I had this very glamorous bracelet, and I was standing behind Miss Sutherland, and it got caught in her wig. And so, in the middle of singing, I had to say, Miss Sutherland, I think if you don't mind, don't move because my hand is stuck in your wig. And if you move, could you move slowly so I can walk slowly beside you? And she burst out laughing. I mean, it was hysterical. I had many instances like that. But Fred, I'm so grateful to you for taking me down memory lane because I just feel so blessed. Going to the Met was like going to your favorite place in the world. It was safe. It was welcoming. I knew most of the stagehands. I knew many people in the orchestra, the backstage crew, Nina Lawson, Jimmy Pinto. I mean, they are like my heroes to this day.
It's interesting. I was going to go to the topic of what we call Met family, and specifically Nina Lawson.
Nina, oh,
Nina
Nina,
Lawson was from Aberdeen, if I remember.
Aberdeen, that's right.
Aberdeen. And she was very no nonsense. Talk about Nina Lawson.
Oh my God, I love Nina. First of all, she was the most organized person I think I've ever met in my life. And making these wigs was extraordinary, but then delivering them to the heads that they were to go on was also extraordinary. And I wrote to her for a while when she retired and went home, and I really missed her. And she was just an extraordinary artist. I wish the public at large could know how many people it gets to get an artist on stage. There was another wonderful lady who's, because of my memory, I can't remember, Rosie. And Rosie was tiny. She and her daughter were the costume. They took care of the costumes. And you'd see this costume walking along, down the corridors. And you couldn't see anybody was holding it because Rosie was very, very tiny. So it was, what a group. And Jimmy Pinto, my God, Jimmy Pinto made my life.
What did he do?
The dearest soul in the world.
What did Jimmy Pinto do?
Jimmy was makeup.
Makeup.
And he was always, if you had a nerve in your body and were, like this, it was gone by the time he left your room. He was just extraordinary.
Now that you mentioned Rosie, there was another very tiny costume person. It must have been a job requirement whose name was Arlene. So much so that Curie Takano referred to her as Little Arlene. And Arlene did a lot of the darning and fixing for Curie's things outside of the Met in addition. But I remember occasionally seeing a dress move along backstage, but no, it was Arlene underneath the dress holding it up.
That's what it was with Rosie. It was just fantastic. It was such, and the only food you could get at the Met in those days was a closet on stage right. And they had coffee and hot dogs and some sort of, I can't remember, croissant or something like that. And when they finally built the beautiful canteen on the second floor or second ground, below ground,
level,
I invited my daughter's entire kindergarten class to the dress rehearsal of Hansel and Gretel, and it was my daughter's birthday is the 24th of December, so I had this party there so that the cake that is ground into the brand new rug that it was then was my responsibility.
That little coffee bar, which was sustenance for all of us, it was not like a fancy modern
No. It was
beanery.
it was a closet, wasn't it?
It was a closet. The guy who ran it was a wonderful Latino guy named Freddie.
Yeah.
And Freddie made Cuban and Puerto Rican coffee, a local brand in New York called El Pico Mas Pico. And it was delicious coffee. And it kept hundreds of Met employees going when there was nothing else.
Completely.
Yeah. And that also was the place, the loading dock, not for the scenery, but for the animals, would come in and out right there. And often I'd have to work the load in for the horses for Carmen or Caballero Rusticana, or the dogs for Rosencavalier for a different show. and all of the animals would come in, and immediately their heads would turn to the left for the smell of Freddie's coffee.
I love it. Yeah, even the
All of
horse
which,
in Fanciulla for Miss Tibaldi, you
yeah,
know?
all of which really tells a story that it's a term we hear about, but you and I were fortunate to live, was the Met family.
It was a family. As you came through the door, remember Winnie?
Winnie.
How are you doing? You know, oh, it was glorious. It was just glorious. You
Winnie
know,
was the receptionist, and UC Bierling died in 1960. She never got over that. That was her favorite.
yeah,
And while she was not supposed to show favoritism to any artist, and she didn't, we all knew that God was UC Bierling, and then there were all these wonderful artists.
yeah,
And part of the experience of Met Family was that all of us who worked there obviously loved and admired a particular artist in a particular way, in addition to loving most of you. But it was our job not to reveal that and not to show favoritism.
yeah.
So I never have revealed my favorite, and I never will. She knows who she is, but and you know who she is, but
Yeah,
but basically the environment was such that you could go down to the canteen in B level,
yeah.
and the rule was if there was an empty seat, you sat down. So that if a chorus member saw a seat next to Joan Sutherland, the chorus member would sit next to Miss Sutherland. And this meant a level of mixing and stage hands. And Nina Lawson, I don't think ever ate, but everybody else. But she probably just had tea and toast in her room.
And it was,
But
and you know, the canteen, it was fabulous food. You
well, I
know,
had a role in that, so thank you very much.
it
It
was
was not it was
fantastic.
not always fantastic food, and when I came in, I just decided we have to fix everything,
Yeah,
and
oh, it
the
was
food got
great.
much better. I agree.
Mozzarella, real, you know,
That
buffalo,
was me.
mozzarella, buffalo. Yeah, yeah, I loved the canteen.
Well, one time it was 1985 or 86. I took Sophia Loren down there, and we cooked eggplant parmigiana in the canteen during a performance of Lohengrin. Now the story comes out. Placido Domingo was singing Lohengrin, and he invited Sophia Loren, Woody Allen, and his then partner Mia Farrow, Al Pacino, Susan Strasberg, and they all sat in a parterre box. And
Oh,
Sophia, after 10 minutes, asked to see the manager, and she came out and she said, how long is this opera? And I said, well, Miss Loren, it's a wonderful opera. And it's 4.5, 5. And she said, what? Ma non è possibile. I said, sì, è possibile. And I spoke to her in Italian. Ah, ma tu parli italiano. So we began to speak in Italian. She said,
yeah.
oh, fame, I'm hungry. And I said, I have an idea. It's a very long opera. My wonderful assistant will take care of this performance, and you and I can go cook. And we went down to B level. It was closed, and I opened it up. And yes, it was mozzarella. That's what made me think of it, because I
Oh,
had it in, and
okay.
tomatoes and eggplant. And I cooked with Sophia Loren, she in a beautiful red suit and high heels.
Yeah.
And after the performance, I had to take her backstage to see Placido Domingo. And great actress that she was. You remember Stanley Levine, the
Of
stage manager?
course. Of course.
Stanley was 100% gay, but nearly fainted with lust at Sophia Loren, and followed her with a flashlight to lead the way. And he said, I would change everything for you, Miss Loren. And
Oh,
and
that is such a good, I love that story,
we
Fred.
got to Placido's dressing room, and he said, oh, Sophia, I'm so happy you were here. She said, Placido, you have no idea what a wonderful time I had tonight. He said, thank you. She said, you're welcome. And that was it.
That is good. You've got to see her new film.
I plan to, yeah.
It's really
Madame
wonderful.
Rosa, based on Madame Rosa.
Yeah.
I plan
And
to.
I've worked with her son when he conducted out here.
Eduardo or Carlo?
Carlo.
Carlo. Okay.
No, wait a minute. Say the what's the first name again?
Eduardo and
Oh,
Carlo.
Carlo.
Okay. Yeah.
And he is adorable. He's the nicest person in the world.
He's a
And
conductor.
I think they made the film together.
They did.
Yeah,
So the thing is, Met Family, I don't talk about current times because I don't work there anymore, but in the era when you and I were there, it was incredibly special because we were doing live broadcasts on radio every Saturday, TV broadcast, not HD.
right.
And the artistic level, I won't say every night, but most
Yeah.
every night was quite stunning. And we got to see other artists and other craftspeople, and in my case, stage directors, because that's what I studied, who were outstanding. And it was an ongoing education. And that's what I loved about working at the Met,
Yeah.
was how much I learned.
Oh, absolutely. And then there was, remember the tour? The Metropolitan Opera tour, when we go on tour?
Well, I only did one tour. I did the last one in 1986 because I was responsible for the Opera House while all of you were on tour.
Yeah.
And I went to then general manager Bruce Crawford and I said, Bruce, for my life experience, I need to know what the tour was like.
Yeah.
So please send me out on the tour. And he did, thankfully. And it was, please talk about the tour and what that meant.
Oh, Fred, you have no idea. It was so much fun. The Met took, in those days, was it Eastern Airlines or I can't remember, and they chartered two planes. So on the plane, very often, Sir Rudolph would be going up and down the aisle serving everybody, which was hysterical. We all stayed sort of nearby each other in hotels at different levels. At my level, I was always sharing a room, I think with Gail or somebody, and it was so much fun. One of the sweet things that comes to mind is something that Tibaldi did, and that was in Cleveland. She had a fan who was a very senior citizen and very disabled, and she lived in Columbus, and she would pay for her way to come to Cleveland every time she was on tour. And then a group of us, and it was Jimmy Pinto and myself often, and we would look after her. We would take her around and, be sure that she got to all the performances. And in those days, in Cleveland, it was in this huge arena. So if you had a front row seat, you were maybe a quarter of a mile away from the stage. It wasn't really opera at its best in that regard. But there she was, and I can't remember her name now, but she was adorable, and we used to look after her. The tour was hysterical. Our absolute favorite place to go was Atlanta, because most of us stayed in Atlanta, and I've driven by it in the years since. It was an old hotel. It's probably gone now, but it had a pool, and oh my God, I remember Bob Merrill, and everybody really relaxed a lot on tour. And the Southern hospitality would come upon us, and I remember going to one dinner, and they weren't going to let me in because in those days I was skinny, and they thought I was maybe one of the ballet corps, and so I didn't qualify to get in, but I got in, and I sat next to Mr. Bing, and I was terrified. How do we talk, and how, and what do I say? And on the other side of him, he had this marvelous Southern belle. He said, "Oh, Mr. Bing, I'm just so very happy to see you, and oh, please have another. Oh, mint juleps, they're nothing. They're just good. They're just a warm up for the evening." And then by the end of the evening, and I don't think it was the mint juleps, he was singing. He was singing Schubert songs and Schumann songs, and it was one of the best moments of my life. But I used to go out to lunch with Luciano, and Luciano had that habit of he'd try a little of what you were having and what everyone was having at the table. Um, you know how opera singers are. They're third graders out on a bus tour having the time of their lives. You know, I loved the tour. Just loved it. And all the people that you met and the donors, and you realized how expensive it was to get it together. But I think it meant a lot to all the communities, and most of the communities have established their own opera houses since.
Well, that's actually a very important point. And for listeners who don't know, the Met was founded in October of 1883 at the Old Metropolitan Opera. And that very first year, it went out on tour around the nearby places like Brooklyn, because believe it or not, Manhattan and Brooklyn were different cities then.
Right.
And therefore, to tour to Brooklyn was a foreign visit. And they went to Boston and very frequently to Philadelphia and Washington, and then began to expand to other cities.
Yeah.
And even at the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, they went to California very often. And in fact, the Met was in San Francisco in 1906, the day of the earthquake.
Really?
And it was a huge financial loss for the Met because at that time, I don't want to make up a number, but at least 20 different productions they brought with them by train, and they would have a residency in San Francisco. Almost all of the productions were destroyed. And Enrico Caruso was there, and he liked to do caricatures, and he drew San Francisco, which burned down, frankly, because after the earthquake, there were fires. And he did drawings of that. And then he hired an oarsman in a little rowboat that took him across San Francisco Bay to Oakland. And that's how he escaped the fires and the earthquake. And he wrote in his memoirs about that. And so the Met was the national opera company because the only other permanent opera company didn't come until 1920, and that was Cincinnati Opera, and then San Francisco Opera in 1932. This is not to say that there was not opera in cities like New Orleans and Chicago and Milwaukee. There was, but there were no permanent companies apart from the Met. So that's how the Met traveled everywhere.
To know that.
And certain cities became favorites. And among them were Atlanta, Cleveland, Boston,
Memphis,
Minneapolis.
Was more darn fun than you. Oh my Lord, did we love Memphis?
Why did you love Memphis?
Oh, it just was that southern, and it was warm, and after Boston and Cleveland, and it was still, I don't know what time the tours were, maybe.
They were May and June, really.
Oh, they were. Well, It was still cold in Boston and Cleveland, so when we got to Atlanta and Memphis, it was heaven. And I was doing roles like, that's it. That was my role.
Don Carlo.
You just heard it. So I could party, and I can remember nights when I was crawling home. I'm ashamed to say, and we just had such a good time. My one big claim to fame is in Minneapolis, which I loved. Ruggero Raimondi said to me once, "Ay, Flica, are you awake later? Because I come and I sing under your window. I sing you a song just especially for you." And I said, "Oh, Ruggero, I'm on the 43rd floor." But that was my one big romance with Ruggero.
In my experience, the greatest Don Giovanni. And I've seen many, and there are many wonderful Don Giovannis, but he really had it all for that role.
He was trained a lot by this extraordinary coach at Glyndebourne named Ubaldo Gardini. Mm-hmm. And I worked everything with Ubaldo. I just adored him. You would not get beyond the second phrase of anything because he'd have so many things to say about no, troppo veloce, troppo veloce. So it was quite a process. But when Ruggero his first time to Glyndebourne, he was misbehaving a lot. And Ubaldo had to sit him down and say, You have to take care of your voice. You just have to. And he agreed. I think Ruggiero must have been early 20s, if not, yeah. He said, I'm your designated nanny for your mother. Your mother told me to take care of you. So that was one of the great starts that he had, was with Ubaldo Gardini.
He's from Bologna, and he's also a terrific cook. And the bolognese meat sauce that I make, that's in one of my cookbooks, is his. And I acknowledge the recipe because it's that good. It's a classic, not made with lots of chunky beef, but it's made very subtly with a lot of milk and carrots and very little tomato,
Yeah,
because the carrots give it sweetness and the color, and the milk softens the meat. It's a phenomenal thing, and
I'm
that's
gonna look it up.
Raimona's
I'm gonna look
recipe.
it up.
I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Um, but just a couple more things from that first year, and then we're going to move on. The women that you mentioned, two of them, Renata Tebaldi and Joan Sutherland, were of their era in another way, in that they traveled with their own costumes. And you were talking about Joan and La Traviata. She was a tall woman, and not a heavy woman, but just large, but she was not heavy.
Yeah,
But the costumes were made for her mostly by a woman named Barbara Matera, and Tebaldi had her costumes made in Italy.
yeah,
And basically, no matter what color the production was, if Renata Tebaldi wanted to wear a certain yellow or gold because she looked good in it, as Tosca, let's say,
yeah.
that's what she wore. And the
I love it.
companies just had to accept that. In Sutherland, it was not about the colors, it was more about the fact that she wanted to have it fit well so that she could breathe properly and sing wonderfully.
Right.
But we don't see that anymore.
No, and they were. I mean, it was the same thing when Joan would come to the Met. You know, when she was there, the whole house was a buzz. It
Yeah.
was just so exciting. Oh, she's here, she's here. Same with Jackie. You know, it was like, oh boy.
Carolyn Horn, yeah.
Um, and so that's what I mean. And Tabaldi was tall. She was
Yes.
she was big too. I mean, not fat, neither of them, but just they were just big girls. You
Yep.
know. I love that they travel with their own costumes. That's the sort of the way it should be, but can't be anymore. You know.
Well, I remember once I met Elizabeth Taylor. I can tell you the date. It was, you don't forget this, March 22nd, 1987.
Yeah.
And I was talking to her about opera, and she was wonderful and gorgeous, a very small woman with beautiful eyes and just a wonderful spirit about her. And I said, Renata Tebaldi and Joan Sutherland travel with their own costumes and clothes. And I've seen pictures of you, Miss, have. And I said, I think 14 or 15. That's all. I traveled 26. And that would be the wherever Elizabeth Taylor went,
Yeah.
26 cases had to go with her.
Well, and I bet those times could never be again. But
Yeah.
aren't we lucky that we knew them? You
Yeah.
know, that was the way. That was, I think, maybe part of the incredible respect for the arts and artists. And I'll never forget taking my kids to a circus when they were little in Germany. And all of the artists in the circus were treated like artists. They all walked out of the tents in beautiful furs and jewels, and you know, there was a great and deep respect for what they did, and I loved that. I loved that I got to see that.
I'm going to add, not only see that, but be that.
But be that. But
Yeah.
be that. Right. Yeah.
So one more artist of that school, going back to the same era, 1972, when you sang Il Re in Don Carlo. Um,
Probably in the wrong place.
the king was Cesare Siepi, the Eboli was Mignon Dunn, the Rodrigo was Robert Merrill, Franco Corelli was Don Carlo, and Montserrat Caballé was Elizabeth. And this is a legendary cast. Caballé didn't travel with as many costumes, but she limited her costumes basically to black.
Yeah.
She said to me once, she said, "Well, I'm Spanish. I can wear black." And I
What
remember
a
the
divine
black
lady.
costumes in this opera with the little sort of little black hat and the veil that came over. And did you get to know her at all? I mean, yes, you were only singing Il Rey in that opera, but
No, I didn't. And I was so smitten by everybody and fairly shy. But there's the cutest story of Miss Cavalier in San Francisco when she was there. And I don't know what I was singing, but I went into the opera house and, a lot of artists who came from Europe when I first started in San Francisco Opera, there were no credit cards or anything like that, or checkbooks. They came with cash. And she went to the rehearsal department at one point and said, would you be kind enough to cash a check for me or get me some cash? And they said, oh yes, of course, Miss Cabé. How much should we get? And you said, let me see. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 3,000. And these kids, they hadn't seen $3,000 in their life. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, yeah, 3,000.
and you really captured her speaking voice
Yes,
just
well,
now.
she was so. I do remember her being funny, but I was laughing from a distance. I
She was
wasn't.
incredibly funny. I don't
Yeah,
know if people knew that about her.
yeah,
And
very
she
funny, very
break
funny.
out laughing in the
Yeah,
middle of, La Traviata. She'd suddenly start laughing. And
yeah. And Bob Merrill, and I can only think of Mac. Great,
Cornell McNeil
Cornell McNeil. He was hysterical.
also.
And I got to know that in Atlanta, sitting around the pool.
It's
And
funny,
Bob,
my tour year, I went to Atlanta because I was told that's where I had to go. But I guess because it was the last year ever of the tour,
yeah,
that it didn't have people were a bit sad. And yes, they were living it up in Atlanta, but you could feel that everything was for the last time.
right.
And the tour got very expensive, number one. But number two, with the Met going to these different cities, many, though not all of them, developed local opera traditions. So, most famously, Dallas. Dallas Opera 1957 began. And it's a wonderful company. You've sung there. I've heard you there. I don't know if you know that. And it's a wonderful company. It's a city that supports opera and built a beautiful opera house. And Minneapolis, Minnesota has a wonderful opera tradition. Somehow Cleveland and Boston did not so much.
Right.
And Atlanta came later, but now it's one of the best companies in America. But it took
And
a
they're
while.
doing thrilling things.
They're
Yeah.
doing wonderful things in
Yeah.
Atlanta. And similarly, San Francisco and Los Angeles were different because San Francisco built its own company in the 1930s, but Los Angeles did not have an opera company until 1984.
Yeah, I think it was just New York City Opera that went there, wasn't it,
Would
for a
go
long
there,
time?
and we have a beloved mutual friend who's going to be joining us later this month, named Nimet. And you stayed, the company, New York City Opera, stayed at the Hotel Figueroa, but the lights went out on the sign, so it was the Hot Fig. That's a true story.
Yeah.
And Beverly Sills, who headed the company, was active with the company,
Yeah.
knowing that the Met didn't go to Los Angeles, brought City Opera to Los Angeles
Right.
and tried to develop an opera tradition, but it didn't happen because Dorothy Chandler, who was the owner of the Los Angeles Times and a big supporter of the arts, built the music center, the Chandler Center, but said no opera here. But it was only after she retired or died that the movement began with Olympics to have an opera company in LA. They began with Carla Maria Giulini doing Falstaff with Renato Bruzone with the LA Philharmonic, but then Peter Hemmings was hired to create an opera company. And actually, he brought me out there to work with him on that. But I was offered a job in LA, but I loved the Met. I was happy at the
Right.
Met. So
Well,
I turned it down, but worked there. But LA has now they do great work.
oh, they
But
do. But also, Fred, I gotta say that Placido really made that company in many, many regards. He gave his heart and soul to it. And the couple of times that I worked there, I stayed in one of the apartments that he and Marta own, and I can remember it was actually during after our big earthquake here, and there were still tremors in Los Angeles, and I remember the sort of light things, the light fixtures swaying in the some of the aftershocks. But I mean, God bless Placido
oh, I
for
know.
all he did there. God bless him. You know, we all love that.
Peter
We all
Hemming
love that
sadly
man.
died pretty young, and it was really Placido who then lifted the company, and
He did, and he got
Christopher
all
Kelch is
the
the
arts, all
manager,
the
and
arts
James
involved.
Conlon is music director. It's a
Yeah,
wonderful company,
Jimmy does it. He's a
Jimmy
great,
Conlon,
great
with
job.
whom
Yeah.
you've worked. Um, I just want to go back to one more topic to our dear Nita Lawson, because I think it's important. Many people who go to the opera don't realize how an opera wig is made. They make a sort of web that fits the skull of each artist.
Right.
Usually you wear a sort of cap to keep your hair in, and then the web goes on top. And the wig designer for the character will use either human hair if it's a dark wig, and they would often at that time would get the hair from Korea, dark, long, dark hair.
Yeah.
But if it was white hair, so when you played Octavian and Octavian had a white wig, that was yak hair that came from Mongolia. And I remember Nina for hours sewing yak hair
Oh,
into this webbing to make the wigs for the 18th century operas. It would be white wigs. Or, and we're going to talk about him later, Jean Pierre Ponel often had white wig characters.
yes.
And therefore, Nina would have to manufacture not just for the soloists, for the chorus. And Idomeneo, which I want to let's talk about Idomeneo right now, had all these white wigs on the chorus in addition to the white wigs on some of the soloists. So let's get to Idomeneo. I'm just going to put a parenthesis here that we'll go
Let me
back
just
to.
let me
Yes.
interrupt 1 second. I want to say to you how fantastic it is that you are doing your show, because it it brings an awareness of what we've all had. My generation, the next generation, even the older generations, um, of what it takes to put those people on stage. I used to figure that for every step I took on stage, there were probably 50 people that got me there, and that's an understatement. I'm not even including the financial parts of it, but just in everything that goes on. And it's hats off to you, and hats off to all the people that,
Well,
contributed
thank you.
their
Well, I
labor.
believe in supporting opera at all the arts, and not just in New York, but really all over the world, because we have viewers all over the world. And all right, I'll put a domino to the side for a moment. You and I,
No, that's okay.
no, but there's a reason anyway. You'll see why. You and I didn't know each other in the 70s, but I discovered in my research that we led kind of parallel lives, in that you left the Met to go to Europe to build your career. And I had not yet been at the Met. I'd worked at the Lyric Opera of Chicago, and I went to Europe, to Italy primarily, to learn more and study and so forth. And so in the mid to late 70s, when I lived there, I got to see you perform a lot in Europe
Oh, okay.
before I came back to work at the Met in 1979, 80, and you came back around the same time. And so working in Europe in the 70s, where you worked with Von Karajan, Schulte, Pinnell, Streller, who was my teacher,
Oh,
Giorgio
I love
Streller.
Australia so much. Oh,
Would you talk about Giorgio Streller specifically in Paris and Cherubino?
oh, you
And
bet I
what was
will.
he like to be directed by, and what did he teach you, and was he difficult?
He was not difficult to these artists. He
Okay.
probably was a nightmare to the house, to the company. But he was not difficult to his. The the thing I remember the most about Giorgio was, and don't think I called him Giorgio either. It was when you were delivering an aria, and in that particular production, there was a very raped stage, and I adore raped stages because I think they just catapult the action out. He would stand beside you and not copy you or instruct you. He would just stand beside you while you were singing. And he knew, of course, he knew the lyrics and what he was doing, but it was like the energy of a tornado going inside you. I'll never forget it. And he insisted on Cherubino walking in a well-born way, in a courtly manner. And I had these gorgeous shoes, handmade. I wish I had bought them or stolen them, because I just was in love with them. And he would work, when we worked the first time was at Versailles, he had the full set up. We weren't in costume, but he had everything. The lights and everything was genuine that was on the set from the production. So that, you could see that could cause quite a lot of trouble for a company. But since we were at the Gabriel Theatre in Versailles, it was possible. And I think I remember that in one session, say from 10 o'clock till 1, we worked on one recit. Susanetta sei tu, son io, that one recit. So and he insisted on, it was 6 weeks of rehearsal every day. By the time you got to the stage, it was second nature to you. It just, he didn't teach us, he infused us. Now, I do remember a couple of times when we had moved into Paris at the Paris Opera, the old Paris Opera, and for some reason, at one point, on the back of the opera, the stage door, it was near Galerie Lafayette, so it was always very crowded. And there was some kind of a demonstration, and there were bombs going off, and all of us were sort of taking cover inside. Out walks Strehler, Giorgio Strehler, right into the middle of it, just where he belongs, And he also never spoke to us he never spoke to me anyway in English. And that's how I learned Italian, because, if he's saying girati, you better learn what it means. And that was a gift. I think he was one of the most brilliant men I've ever known. And with a brilliant heart.
Yeah.
He went smack to the beginning.
All of his productions had humanity. I wouldn't say that they had simplicity because they're all thought through, but they were all very spontaneous.
Right.
And so that your Cherubino was remarkably spontaneous, even in the context of what Da Ponte and Mozart gave you and all the moments that the character has. But I always remember thinking that Strehler invented each of these operas that either I worked with him on, which were a few Mozart operas and Verdi's Simone Boccanegra and Macbeth. And you reminded me of something just now that I forgot about. This accompanying the artist on the stage. We did Simone Boccanegra about 2 years after your Cherubino. We did it in Milan. And it's a brilliant production. And Morella Freni was the Maria Amelia. And she stood at the top of the stage. And Strehler came and walked with her down. And it was my job then to restage the scene when Strehler was on tour. And Freni stood at the top of the stage, and I waited sort of at the bottom of the stage near the orchestra pit, and Abbado was in the pit. And he whispered to me, and he said, "Fred, you have to go up to the stage. Morella is waiting for you." And I went up there, and she said to me in Italian, she said, "Scendo solo con un direttore." I only go down with the director.
God
And
love her. That's great.
it was fascinating because you remind me of something else, that yes, we only worked in Italian.
Yeah,
And that's a change from then to now, is that in many theaters in Europe and even often at the Met, we would work in Italian because that was the common language of opera, even if we
right.
were doing a German or Russian or English or French opera, because if you had a Korean tenor and a Russian baritone and a Polish soprano and a South American mezzo and so on, we spoke Italian to each other.
Yeah.
And yes, I kind of spoke it before I came under Streller's influence, but Zeffirelli did that too in Europe, not at the Met. He spoke in English at the Met.
Yeah.
But I always wonder whether Streller would have had more of a career in the States if he had spoken more English and
Uh,
what we
I,
missed. Because,
I suspect,
yeah,
and I'm just saying it from my little knowledge of him, that what he insisted upon, which was so valuable, wouldn't have been able to have been supported by the companies.
yeah,
And if he almost was like, I think he was like a film director, in many regards. He oversaw everything. I mean, in the very first time that we did Marriage of Figaro in Versailles, he staged each act. It was a different time of day.
hmm,
And it was so brilliant the way the light would come. The light really came across windows just the way it would in the early morning. And so much of that is part of his plan that I'm not sure that companies could have supported that. But I don't think, because I've heard him, I mean, he knew German. I know he knew German because I've heard him speak German. I don't think he knew much English or didn't choose to speak it, maybe.
he was from Trieste and he was bilingual German Italian because
Right.
people in Trieste often are. So
Yeah.
that's why his German was good. And I did work on some German operas with him, especially Die Entführung aus dem Serail, the abduction from the Seraglio, which we did in Salzburg.
Yeah.
And his German was flawless.
Yeah.
And so,
And he spoke,
but
I remember him speaking French to,
mhm.
to the machiniste and everybody at Paris Opera.
But in 1976, I was not there, but you were on tour in Washington at the Kennedy Center for the bicentennial in I believe, an Australia production. I should have checked this before coming, but I believe that you came with the Paris Opera and La Scala.
That's right. I
Yeah.
remember that. Yeah. Actually, I don't remember that, but I'm glad that you reminded me. um, but when a production belongs, and Jean-Pierre was the same, when a production belongs that intensely to the man who created it, it'll sort of never be the same for you afterwards. It's too special. It's just too magnificent.
Which leads me to Jean-Pierre Ponel,
Okay.
um, who I scarcely knew. I met him, but I didn't have any work experience with him, but I revered him. And as my guests know, always, I ask them to provide me with some musical selections that we'll talk about in a bit. I added one. Um, I've never done this before because all the selections are from the Adagio catalog. I added a YouTube clip that is not from Adagio, and my apologies to Adagio, which I love, because Ponel's production of La Cenerentola, which is a wonderful opera, but not my favorite opera, but it's a wonderful opera, I think is the most perfect opera production I've ever seen of anything ever.
I have to agree with you. I really do. I've only done one other production, but I think it's Jean-Pierre has an incredible inner sense of chic, really chic, as basic as that. He was such an artist, and he created these sets that they were often related in some degree, but he had this perfection of the visual presentation of it with costumes as well, and they were so distinctly his. I think he was a mastermind. I really do. I adored him. Mad, mad crush on Jean-Pierre.
If my memory serves, he was French Swiss and not French.
Uh huh.
But I mentioned that only because while for many people I'm Italian identified, I've spent a lot of my time studying French culture and history and art and so on. And the French philosophers have reason, and the rationality that so informs just about everything French, except for a few irrational things. But for the most part, everything is based on reason, which is something I fully embrace. And Ponel's productions were all about that.
Right. You are so right about that. And having lived in France as long as I did, that's one of the things I adored more than anything. I mean, you go to the market and how everything is laid out, and you don't, at least when I was there, you didn't go to one big supermarket, but even there was a certain chic about it. And if you didn't like your strawberries, you'd say, "Oh, madame, les fraises, c'était pas formidable." She'd say, "Oh, oh, oh, non, c'est pas possible. Oh là là. Voilà, je vous donne," they'd give you a whole new thing of strawberries because you said they weren't quite ripe, and it was expected. It was expected, and I learned the most about French, both speaking and appreciating, when I was a nanny there, way before singing anything. My first opera was at the Paris Opera because I had a boyfriend who was, he wasn't, it was a big military school, but he had the Napoleon outfit on, and of course I'm going to go to a ball at the Opera House with that decor. But it was from living there that I learned to just so appreciate everything French. Going to the doctor was amazing. Everything. So I agree with you.
I've been to French doctors. I know exactly what you're saying.
It becomes, you're in their home. They practically ask you for tea. It's.
Yep.
But
So is that why you sang J'aime le militaire?
You're darn right. I wish I. Oh, it was the École Militaire.
Yeah. Right.
He's now a judge. This
Good.
boyfriend.
Ponel.